Our scripture today comes from the book of Daniel, chapter 2, verses 1 to 24. It's on page 1370 in UP Bibles. In the second year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His mind was troubled, and he could not sleep. So the king summoned the magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers to tell him what he had dreamed. When they came in and stood before the king, he said to them, "I have had a dream that troubles me, and I want to know what it means." Then the astrologers answered the king in Aramaic, "O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will interpret it." The king replied to the astrologers, "This is what I have firmly decided. If you do not tell me what my dream was and interpret it, I will have you cut into pieces and your houses turned into piles of rubble. But if you tell me the dream and explain it, you will receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. So tell me the dream and interpret it for me." Once more they replied, "Let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will interpret it." Then the king answered, "I am certain that you are trying to gain time, because you realize that this is what I have firmly decided. If you do not tell me the dream, there is just one penalty for you. You have conspired to tell me misleading and wicked things, hoping the situation will change. So then, tell me the dream, and I will know that you can interpret it for me." The astrologers answered the king, "There is not a man on earth who can do what the king asks. No king, however great and mighty, has ever asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or astrologer. What the king asks is too difficult. No one can reveal it to the king except the gods, and they do not live among men." This made the king so angry and furious that he ordered the execution of all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree was issued to put the wise men to death, and the men were sent to look for Daniel and his friends to put them to death. When Arioch, the commander of the king's guard, had gone out to put to death the wise men of Babylon, Daniel spoke to him with wisdom and tact. He asked the king's officer, "Why did the king issue such a harsh decree?" Arioch then explained the matter to Daniel. At this, Daniel went into the king and asked for time so that he might interpret the dream for him. Then Daniel returned to his house and explained the matter to his friends Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. He urged them to plead for mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that he and his friends might not be executed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. During the night, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision. Then Daniel praised the God of heaven and said, "Praise be to the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are his. He changes times and seasons. He sets up kings and deposes them. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in darkness, and light dwells with him. I thank and praise you, O God of my fathers. You have given me wisdom and power, and you have made known to me what we asked of you. You have made known to us the dream of the king." As kind of a roadmap for where we've been and where we're going in sermon series, what I normally do is I have, between Advent and Easter, I have basically just follow the lectionary, which is a list of things that you're supposed to preach on as preachers during that time. In between, I have some fun with it. And so we're going to be going through the book of Daniel for the next couple months. And then after that, there's going to be a quick break, and then we're going to be in Revelation, which is a book of the same genre, for a couple months, and then we're going to be back in Advent. So that's just the whole next 8 months planned out for you. So now you know what's going on. And in fact, we actually already started this right before we went to the lectionary for Advent. And so we are picking up just in chapter 2 of the book of Daniel. If you want, you can go back to November or whatever, when I preached on Daniel 1. But just to kind of summarize what's gone so far. In around 600 BC, the Babylonian Empire conquered Israel. And when that happened, the Babylonians decided to deport all of the most talented and wise administrators from the Israelites. They took them from their homeland and plopped them in the middle of Babylon. So these Jews were left all alone in a foreign kingdom with a foreign land surrounded by foreign people. So they faced a number of really important challenges, not unlike the challenges that any immigrant might experience going into a new culture, except with a lot more violence, perhaps, in some cases. They were Jews, and they were proud of being Jews. And yet everything around them seemed to be conspiring to change that. They lived so far away from their roots that it would just be easier to put down their roots somewhere else. Everyone looks down on you for being a Jew. There's hardly any Jews around you. So why not just stop being a Jew and become a Babylonian? So it became clear very early on that the primary battleground of the book of Daniel is the one of identity. The question for these exiles was how they would maintain their identity. How would they remain Jews? In fact, the Jews were a persecuted minority in huge empires for hundreds of years. And so the question of how to remain Jews in this kind of situation and this kind of opposition continued for years. So Daniel became a really important book on how to stay who you are in the midst of opposition. As we talked about a couple months ago, this is a situation that is actually very similar to the one that we are in all the time as Christians. Because Christians have decided to give their ultimate allegiance to our King, Jesus Christ, rather than the kingdom of this world. Christians have decided to belong to a different minority people and even to a different world than the rest of the world. Since our baptism, we have been regenerated with the power of the new heavens and the new earth, with the Spirit that raised Jesus Christ from the dead, and that has become our home, and not the world we live in now. But still, we live in this world here and now, surrounded by the rulers of this world and the citizens of this world, even as we live as citizens of heaven, of a different kingdom. And just like Babylon tried its best to destroy Daniel's identity as a Jew, the kingdom of this world is often doing its best to compromise our identity as Christians. It's very difficult to live as foreigners in a foreign land. Even if it doesn't happen as dramatically as it did in Babylon, you can feel it in large and small ways all the time. You feel worldly ways of looking at things sneaking into your thoughts all the time. Someone does something evil, and your first thought is on revenge and violence rather than justice and mercy. You know that the right thing to do with your life is to give it away for God and for other people. But you can't help but hear the motto, "You only live once," in your ears with every sacrifice you make. You know that the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, and you can't help but look at your bank account like a scoreboard. It's extremely hard to live as a member of an entirely different kingdom right in the middle of a world that seems to have all the power. And that's what makes Daniel really useful for us today. We need to know how to live with an entirely different identity from the one that everyone around us has. So for the first couple of weeks in the book of Daniel, several months ago, we focused on what is probably the most powerful tool at our disposal as Christians to make sure that we are living in the kingdom of Jesus Christ rather than compromising to the kingdom of this world, which is community and identity. Humans are social creatures. The things we believe and the way we live is reinforced and confirmed by the people we live with. So if you want to live one way, but no one else around you lives that way, you're very unlikely to be successful. And that's why we have the church. If you wanted to live like a Mongolian, but you've never met a Mongolian, you don't live anywhere near any Mongolians, and you're just going to try to figure out based on a book you read about how to be Mongolian, it's going to be very difficult, to say the least. You know, actual Mongolian people might even recognize what you're trying to do, but they probably wouldn't agree that you've actually managed to live as a Mongolian. Eventually, without a community around you to shape you around your Mongolian identity, to correct you when you're changing, to show you what it means to belong to that culture, even people born into Mongolian culture would lose that heritage. And the same thing is true with being a Christian. The Bible is a wonderful thing, but if you say, I have the Bible, I don't need to come to church or hang out with other Christians to know what it means to be Christian, you've missed out on one of the most powerful ways to live authentically as a Christian. It would almost be as hard as trying to learn how to be Mongolian by reading a book about being Mongolian. It's impossible for one fish to swim upstream, but a pack of fish together, perhaps, drafting off each other and helping each other when they're tired, might actually have a chance. It's almost impossible to live as a member of the kingdom of God in the kingdom of this world. But living as a community devoted to God could actually work out. But here we are going to focus on another key tool that we need if we're going to live as members of the kingdom of Jesus Christ in the midst of the kingdom of this world, which is wisdom. As the book of Daniel introduces us to the first major conflict in Daniel's life, Daniel gives a hymn praising God for his wisdom. And this is important because it will be a key theme in the chapters to come. It will also be the only way that Daniel and his fellow exiles will remain Jews through this spiritually dangerous period of the exile. Wisdom in Hebrew is related to words that have to do with skill, even more than it's related to words that have to do with intelligence. In the ancient world, much of the writing about wisdom was mostly written for rulers and nobles about how to rule skillfully. It was something much closer to Machiavelli than it was to the Bible. It wasn't so much about how to be the most moral, how to protect people's rights as well as you can, how to be a good person that people love, so much as how to rule successfully as a king or ruler, whatever it means morally. And sure, justice and goodness comes into the equation. You want, at the very least, for people to see you as good. You want justice in your kingdom because then people might not get as angry and revolt against you. But there's a recognition that justice and morality sometimes have to play second fiddle to what keeps you in power. You have to go to war sometimes. You have to enforce taxation in order to build yourself great structures and statues for propaganda. I am the great king who built this wonderful statue. If you're going to tax people, it's better to tax your enemies who already hate you than your friends who are keeping you in power. That way you can weaken your enemies and strengthen your friends. That is what wisdom is about in the ancient world, skillfully getting through life in order to achieve success. It is also sometimes what wisdom is about in the Bible. When you read the book of Proverbs, which is the book of the Bible that's all about wisdom, it's full of promises about the success you can achieve if you hold fast to the wisdom it teaches. In fact, sometimes Proverbs is almost shockingly pragmatic. In Proverbs 6:26, it says that if you're going to sin sexually, it is better to do so with a prostitute than with another man's wife. Because the price of a prostitute is a loaf of bread, while a married woman hunts down a precious life. Wisdom is making good decisions that lead to success. And while it's a bad decision to sin with a prostitute, it's less bad than to sin with another man's wife. Both decisions will fail. One will lead to even greater destruction. In that way, wisdom in the Bible is, in some ways, a lot like the wisdom in the ancient world. But there's a few insights about the book of Proverbs that makes it fundamentally different. That has actually changed the world and spawned philosophies that we sometimes take for granted. Proverbs says that what is most likely to lead to success, what is most wise, is also the most moral. This is a crazy statement when you really think about it, when you try to apply it to the rest of your life. See, when you live your life out there in the world, you are consistently feeling like you have to make choices between what is moral and what is most likely to lead to success. When I'm driving and I'm about to miss my turn, should I just go to the next exit, or should I slow everyone down and force my way into the exit lane so that I can get off? Like, this is the choice that we often have to make. Do I do the successful thing, or do I do the most moral thing? It's probably most moral to just get to the next exit. You're good, right? Should I do the moral thing and keep the traffic flowing, or should I do the thing that will lead to success for me to get where I need to go at all costs? The book of Proverbs does not recognize this distinction at all. It says that you can get the best of both worlds in the long run. The right thing will be the right thing to do, will also be the most successful thing over a long enough time period. And that seems insane. So Proverbs posits that even though you might get ahead with a moral behavior in the short term, it will eventually catch up with you. One day, you'll force your way into the exit lane, slow everyone down like you always do, and you won't check your blind spot and just get right and hit. And then it'll be all your fault. At that point, the 5 minutes that you saved here and there to avoid missing your turn won't matter at all compared to the wasted hours and days and the consequences of the accident. As with driving, so Proverbs would say, as with all of life. After all, there is a God that made the entire universe, and that God cares a lot about morality, as opposed to the rest of the gods of the ancient world. So when you are doing his will, you're living in harmony with the basic laws and intention of the universe and the God that made it. It may cost you now to follow his laws, but it will benefit you in the long run. It will pay off later. But when you do evil, Proverbs says, you are stepping out on your own without God. You're putting chaos into the equation. You never know what's going to happen, and you're at the mercy of forces that you cannot understand. After all, doing evil to get ahead is predicated on the idea that you understand what you're doing and all the consequences that could come of it. I'm going to do this evil thing so that this good thing will result. And no, but very few people do evil things in order that evil things might result. But in the grand scheme of things, even the smartest ones of us, know practically nothing. We don't know ourselves. We don't know the people around us. We don't even know the physical properties of the things around us. How can we expect that we can venture out on our own, totally divorced from God's intention, and things will actually work out in the long run? See, what often happens is we venture out on our own, we do evil so that good might result, and then evil results anyway. It doesn't end up working out. But the thing is that the long run is extremely difficult to see. The disaster of getting in a car crash is relatively unlikely. I can't see the car coming at me, so it's not there. The disaster of missing your turn, though, on the other hand, is certain. So we often choose the immoral but short-term successful way out instead of the moral way that leads to long-term blessing. And then we try and stop Siri from talking in the middle of my sermon. There we go. Where was I? We often choose the immoral but short-term successful way out instead of the moral way that leads to a long-term blessing. It often takes a leap of faith to believe in wisdom, to believe in the promise of Proverbs that the most successful way out is also the moral way. Now, one of the key insights about wisdom from the Old Testament, as opposed to the rest of ancient literature, is that wisdom ultimately comes from God. For other ancient peoples, they didn't believe that the wisdom actually came from the gods at all. It was a human things that we did about how to live as humans in the human world. The gods didn't have a whole lot to say about it. They really wanted to live their own lives, and you guys can do whatever you want so long as you feed us. In fact, this was one of the most unique things about how ancient Jews thought about wisdom compared to the people around them. When you read literature about wisdom from ancient Babylonians and ancient Egyptians who the Israelites had contact with, or even literature about wisdom from the ancient Confucians, for instance, you really don't hear very much about the role of the gods and how to live a successful life. So while this might seem obvious to us, the idea that wisdom ultimately comes from God, that is almost completely unique to this tradition. We believe that God has revealed how to live in a way that brings wholeness and peace both now and in the life to come. And sure, wisdom from other traditions can be very nice and helpful about how to live as humans. Without the wisdom that comes from God, you're ultimately arranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. We both have to live wisely, or we all will have to live wisely, or we will go on to destruction. And God has to reveal that wisdom, or we will never get it. Again, because we are sitting in church, the idea that wisdom comes from God seems obvious to us. Everything comes from God, sure. But there's a reason that this is a unique and different thing from what every other religious tradition has said. In fact, in our daily lives, how often do you really think about wisdom coming from God? See, wisdom is the knowledge that you need in order to live a successful life, which is all true, but the problem comes down to how we define success. Over time, humans are pretty good at fighting and finding the best way to achieve a certain outcome, to be successful, however you define it. If your goal is to retire as early as possible, that's a pretty solved game. Follow the advice of most financial planners. Put the money you've saved into a low-cost index fund or ETF, save as much as you can early to take advantage of compound interest, use tax-advantaged accounts like HSAs and 401ks, you get the deal. It's a solved problem. Don't go into too much debt, and if you do, make sure you pay off your high-interest loans as soon as possible. You get the drill. This is the human way of getting to retire as soon as you can. If you're a young person who's very talented, there will be common wisdom in your culture all around you pushing you to follow a certain path. You should probably go to college, major in a STEM field of some kind, do some internships over the summers. If you really want to go off the beaten path, you might go to a trade school for a few years and find good paying work in a blue-collar job. And you'd probably be fighting some teachers who think you should go to college. There's one well-worn path in our culture for success, however it's defined. But leaving that well-worn path is likely to lead to failure as our culture defines it. But think about how little God comes into the equation for any of those things in our culture either. So you see that our culture, like practically everyone that has ever existed, has a very specific picture of what it looks like to be successful and the steps along that path. And all of these are really good advice for how to achieve that vision of success. It really is good for your retirement if you invest early. STEM normally is a pretty safe bet for a good career for a smart and talented young person. But how much is God in the equation here? In our common sense, in our basic wisdom about how to live life, God really isn't in the equation. So our culture really is no different from every other in that we believe that wisdom is ultimately a human invention. Now, obviously, what I'm telling you shouldn't be all that surprising. There are plenty of laws against telling kids in public schools that they should seek God's will in their employment decisions. It's literally illegal to do so. And most people probably think that the retirement planning is a mostly secular exercise. I'm not making this point to shock you. I'm making this point in order to highlight what is already obvious to all of us. The basic common wisdom in our culture and most cultures about what you should do with your life, what you should do with your money, what goals you should pursue, all of that, does not take God's will into account at all. We've already recognized that this is the case, and we've even recognized that this seems obvious and inevitable to us. But let's put two and two together here. This means that if you follow the basic common sense wisdom of this world and our culture about how you should structure and plan your life, the goals you pursue, the work you do, all of it, that means you will not have taken God's will into account at all for your whole life, including in all of the most important decisions you have ever made. Isn't that a problem? Our culture, like most cultures throughout time, does not train you with the wisdom to seek God's will when planning your life. This really is something that you will not find in any community in our society. The only community that trains you to follow God's will in structuring and planning your life is the church. And yet, even in the church, you will find some people will probably think you're kind of weird for breaking from the common sense wisdom of the world. But if you take God's will into account at all, you will necessarily break from the common sense wisdom of this world. This is one of the main ways that the kingdom of Jesus Christ is fundamentally different from the kingdom of this world. Because we actually believe that wisdom comes from God, not from human beings, even from what everyone around us just considers common sense. And as radical as the book of Proverbs is in telling us to have absolute faith in wisdom, to have absolute faith in God, that his way will lead to the best things for us in the long run, even if it takes the resurrection for it to be true, the book of Daniel and its tradition is even more radical. Daniel comes from a genre of literature called apocalyptic. But of course, when we hear the word apocalypse, we think of the end of the world. But apocalyptic is actually much more than that. The word apocalypse in Greek is a Greek word which means revelation. The book of Revelation in Greek is the Apocalypse of John. And it's the revelation or the revealing of the hidden truths of creation. See, Proverbs is all about telling us about these basic common sense truths of the world, but in the perspective of God, right? From the perspective of God. That there's common sense things, and if you follow them, good things will happen. But Daniel in books of Apocalyptic says that there's whole swaths of wisdom which are not common sense at all, that are hidden and need to be revealed by God. You can see it in our passage in Daniel. All the king's nobles could never understand or even say what the vision was that the king had. Only Daniel could, because the wisdom was hidden. Daniel says, "He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what's in the darkness, and the light dwells within him. He reveals deep and hidden things." Reveals in the Greek translation is apocalypse. "To you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we asked of you." As radical as Proverbs is, at least Proverbs appears to be common sense at its base. It is clear that if you do bad stuff for long enough, it's likely to catch up with you at some point. But what Daniel and apocalyptic literature says is that there are massive forces that are working in the background that are far beyond our understanding. Spirits and demons and angels and beasts and statues. And our own reasoning, our own wisdom that comes from common sense, even from books like Proverbs, could never hope to lead us to live life the right way. To successfully make it through, and this is especially true when you're living in exile, when you're living as one minority people amidst an empire of the kingdom of this world. It is often hard to live wisely. It is hard to have faith that your commitment to Jesus Christ will lead to success in the long run, that it will pay off. Especially when your commitment, as far as what your eyes see, can lead only to martyrdom, like it does for people all around the world today, and like it seemed like it would for Daniel and his friends countless times throughout the book. See, Proverbs leans a bit on the idea that we really don't know the results of our actions, so why not depend on the wisdom of God, who actually knows things, to decide our actions? If we do evil things, that good may result, the good may never actually result. Apocalyptic books, on the other hand, lean entirely on this idea. Faced with dire consequences, the only thing that could lead you to hand over your life for what is right is total and complete dependence on the wisdom of God. Because if you're only going with what your eyes see, martyrdom and disobedience to the ruling authorities can only lead to destruction. There is no reasonable, common sense reason why someone should hand over their lives to be killed for God. So apocalyptic books emphasize that reasonable common sense only goes so far. That there are massive forces beyond our understanding that make our wisdom, our own wisdom, our common sense, wholly inadequate to the task of living the Christian life. And though we may not face martyrdom, we have to face the task of living an entirely different way from this world all the time. In my own life, this has been a constant struggle. I've never been faced with martyrdom, but I've always been faced with the alternatives. What does God want for me, and what do I want for myself? Because I've always known very well, I've been taught from a young age, the common sense way of life that I was meant to live. In middle and high school, people were often surprised that I went to church as often as I did. And I remember coming home from school in college and telling my friends that I was majoring in biblical and theological studies. And they were all very nice people, so they wouldn't outright tell me that I was being stupid. But I knew what was going through their minds. Something like, "You worked that hard in school for this? What kind of future are you looking for?" And even then, all throughout college, I believed that I would be a professor. And there were certainly great things about that job that attracted me. But in the end, God had to force me to become a pastor by making it basically impossible to find a job as a professor. And eventually, I realized, even a few years later, that the real reason I wanted to become a professor, even in studying the Bible, which was already a great step in faith, was worldly. Because being a professor is considered a high-class job. Academics are held to high esteem, and academics sometimes look down on pastors for being in the weeds instead of in an ivory tower. I realized that even when I departed from the well-worn path of the people around me, I had followed the common sense wisdom of this world rather than the wisdom of God. And the only thing that saved me was God literally closing all the doors. Or in getting married, I really had to struggle with the wisdom of this world. Because in our culture, the common sense thing is that there isn't much point to marriage at all. There's no need to commit yourself to a single person forever, because what if you grow tired of them someday? What if your plans change and you need to move? What if you change as a person yourself? And if you do get married, you should wait until you're in your 30s when you really know who you are and what you're settled as a person. You should live together with the person you're marrying for a few years as a test run. You should delay having babies until you have everything else in your life figured out, until you've experienced everything you need to experience, because in our culture, that's kind of the end. If you have babies at all, right? And so it was honestly terrifying to have to fight against that common sense because I felt like God was calling me to marry someone. And that even when I knew I was marrying a wonderful woman, I knew that God's wisdom was different from the wisdom of this world. And it takes a terrifying leap of faith to follow God's wisdom when everyone and everything around you is telling you that you're being a fool. And what I'm saying here is not all that rare. In fact, I think it's probably all of your experience at one point or another in your life, or even every day. You find yourself doing things because you believe in the wisdom of Jesus Christ rather than the wisdom of this world. And almost always leads to a terrifying leap of faith. The time when you have to choose to do something which is fundamentally weird from the world's standards, but obvious and inevitable if you're following Jesus. Because you're living in two worlds. You have two voices in your head. You're speaking two languages. And you know the wisdom of this world extremely well. You grew up in it. You followed it from birth. It was taught to you from the beginning. But you also know the wisdom of Jesus Christ, who, in a way that was totally foolish by the world's standards, took on flesh and became poor, who went to the cross in love for us and for our salvation. The wisdom of Jesus Christ is foolishness to the world. And not just the kind of harmless foolishness like collecting baseball cards or eating too much ice cream, but the kind of foolishness that leads people to treat you with contempt. What kind of idiot would live like that? After all, the world and its wisdom crucified Jesus. The wisdom of this world doesn't just avoid taking the wisdom of God into account, it is sometimes actively hostile to it. Jesus says, "Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you." And you'll find times where your wires are crossed and you think, man, am I so arrogant as to think that what I really should do is something so totally different from what the whole rest of the world thinks I should do. I mean, am I sure that God is calling me to do this? And I can tell you that most of the time, the answer is yes. Because why else would you get it in your head that you should do this crazy thing that makes you look weird in front of all your friends and family, and the only thing you have to gain from it is God's approval? That sounds like something that comes from God. In fact, it sounds like deep and hidden things, the things that dwell in the darkness, but are only revealed by God because light dwells within him. Yes, when you are called by God to live in a way that's fundamentally different from the world, it is worth considering that this calling is an apocalypse, a revelation of the hidden order of creation by God to you. What this means is that every time you aim to please God rather than follow the common sense wisdom of this world, you are expressing profound and radical faith in the wisdom of God over human wisdom. You are saying that ultimately God is the one in control of this world, even to the point that he's directing empires centuries down the line that you had never even heard of. And as difficult as this radical hope really is, it is entirely necessary if you're going to live the Christian life, if you're going to aim to please God with your life. There's just no other way. Because as we've seen, the common sense wisdom of this world does not and cannot take into account the will of God. And if you're not doing weird things, it is likely you're simply following the kingdom of this world instead of the kingdom of Jesus Christ. This is what the Jewish characters in the book of Daniel constantly have to do. Everyone around them is bowing to a statue, because in the wisdom of the people around them who believed in many gods, after all, what's one more god that you have to bow down to? And the king can promise you wealth and goods and status for the rest of your life, so why not do what he says? Meanwhile, he's telling you he's going to throw you in a furnace and kill you if you don't. But filled with the wisdom of the kingdom of God, the three youths in the book of Daniel refuse to bow down. Or the king might ban prayer to your God for a month. And after all, it's just a month. Why not just pray double next month to make up for it? But Daniel refuses and prays anyway. Foolishness, according to the kingdom of this world, but the wisdom of Jesus Christ. Because in the end, God has different goals than we do. The world is very good at finding good ways to maximize wealth. But is maximizing wealth the best goal to work towards? Will it bring you ultimate fulfillment and happiness? Or should God be calling you to have no more than is comfortable, or even to be a little bit uncomfortable? These are correct questions that us Christians have to answer, which the kingdom of the world considers insane. It is their default assumption that you should try and maximize your wealth, and everything they tell you to do is based on that assumption. But are you really called to do that? The world believes that freedom is the highest good, that anything that limits your choices should be swept away. But the kingdom of Jesus Christ has a different kind of wisdom, which says that you should give up all you have to be a servant, that you should bind yourself, even limit the choices to make sure that you don't make the wrong one. That is insane from the perspective of the kingdom of this world, but it's common sense for followers of Jesus. Make me a captive, Lord, and then I shall be free. So pray for the wisdom that can only come from God. Pray for God to show you his way in the midst of a world whose way is totally different. And rely on God's wisdom always. This is our only hope. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths. Be not wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord, and turn away from evil. Amen.